glitch in the soul. I've always loved a good scare, and so have my friends Jake and Mia. That's why we were so excited to try out the new virtual reality game Blair Witch. We'd heard it was the most realistic horror game ever made, and we couldn't wait to dive in. When we put on our VR headsets, the world around us instantly disappeared. I felt a chill run down my spine as the new environment formed before my eyes. We were standing at the edge of a dark, creepy forest. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like claws. A thick fog clung to the ground, and everything was eerily quiet. "Welcome to Blair Witch," a deep voice boomed from nowhere. "Survive if you can." Mia, always the bravest, grinned and said, "This is amazing. Look at the detail." Jake, who loved to act tough, just shrugged. "Yeah, it's cool. But remember, it's just a game." But I wasn't so sure. There was something about the forest that felt too real, too alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We started walking down the narrow path in front of us. The ground was soft and damp beneath our feet, and the air was cold and heavy. Every now and then, I thought I saw something move in the shadows, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Mia led the way, eager to explore. "We should look for clues or something," she said. "That's how these games usually work, right?" I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, let's just stick together. I don't want to get lost in here." We walked deeper into the forest, and the trees seemed to close in around us. The path twisted and turned, and I lost track of how far we'd gone. The whole place felt like a maze, and the further we went, the more the unease settled in my gut. Then, out of nowhere, we saw a small, run-down cabin. It was barely visible through the trees, but there it was, old and decaying. The windows were dark, and the wood looked like it had been rotting for years. "What do you think?" Mia asked, already moving toward it. "Is this part of the game?" Jake hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, probably. Let's check it out." I didn't want to go in, but I couldn't stay outside alone either. So I followed them to the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, and when Mia pushed it open, it creaked like in every horror movie I'd ever seen. Inside, it was pitch black, and a musty smell hit me as soon as we stepped through the door. "Welcome," the voice from earlier whispered again, but this time, it sounded like it was coming from inside the cabin with us. "You've entered the heart of the woods. But beware, you're not alone." I turned around, looking for the exit, but where the door had been was just more darkness. "Guys, something's wrong," I said, my heart pounding. "We should log out." Mia tried first, tapping the side of her headset. "It's not working," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't get out." Jake tried too, but nothing happened. We were stuck. Panic started to creep in, but I tried to keep it together. This was just a game, right? It had to be. But the shadows in the cabin seemed to move, and the air felt thick with something I couldn't explain. "This isn't supposed to happen," I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. But I knew they were thinking the same thing. We were in trouble, and I didn't know how we were going to get out. We stood there in the dark, all of us too scared to speak. The reality of the situation started to sink in. This wasn't just some glitch or clever trick the game developers had put in. Something was really wrong. "Maybe we should search the cabin," Jake said, breaking the silence. His voice sounded steady, but I could tell he was forcing it. "There's got to be something here that'll help us figure this out." Mia nodded, her usual confidence shaken. "Yeah, maybe there's a way to trigger the exit, like a hidden switch or something." I didn't like the idea of splitting up, but we didn't have much choice. The cabin was small, with just a few pieces of broken furniture and some shelves covered in dust. We started searching, our footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. As I moved deeper into the cabin, I felt a strange pull, like something was guiding me. In the corner of the room, I found an old book lying on a table. The cover was worn and cracked, and the pages looked brittle, but there was something about it that drew me in. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. The pages were filled with strange symbols and writing I couldn't understand. But as I flipped through it, I found a page with what looked like a map. My heart skipped a beat when I realized it was a map of the forest we were in. There were markings on it, X's that seemed to indicate different locations within the woods. "Mia, Jake, come look at this," I called out. They hurried over, and we crowded around the table. Mia frowned as she looked at the map. "It's like a guide," she said, tracing one of the X's with her finger. "Maybe if we find these spots, we can figure out how to get out of here." "But what if it's a trap?" Jake asked, voicing the fear we were all feeling. "We don't know what's out there." "Do we have a choice?" I replied. "Sitting here isn't going to get us anywhere. We need to try something." Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, you're right. Let's do it." We left the cabin, stepping back into the cold, dark forest. The air felt even heavier than before, and the trees seemed to loom closer together. I held the book tightly, the map our only hope of finding a way out. As we followed the path marked on the map, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The fog was thicker, and strange noises echoed through the trees, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and distant whispers that seemed to be coming from all around us. Every sound made me jump, and I could tell Mia and Jake were just as tense. We reached the first marked spot on the map. It was a small clearing with an ancient-looking stone altar in the center. The air here was colder, and the silence was deafening. Mia stepped forward, her breath visible in the icy air. "What now?" she asked, looking at me. I glanced at the map again, then at the altar. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Maybe there's something on the altar that we need to activate." Jake walked up to it, brushing away the leaves and dirt that had gathered on the stone. "There's something carved here," he said, squinting at the symbols. "It looks like the ones in the book." I flipped through the book until I found a page with similar symbols. "It's a spell," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Or something like that. Maybe if we—" "I don't know, read it." Mia looked at me, her eyes wide. "Are you serious? What if it makes things worse?" "We don't have any other options," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We need to try something." I started reading the symbols aloud, my voice trembling as I did. The words felt strange on my tongue, like they didn't belong to any language I knew. As I spoke, the air around us seemed to shift, growing colder and heavier. The shadows in the trees started to move, and a low, rumbling sound echoed through the forest. Suddenly, the altar started to glow with a faint, eerie light. The ground beneath our feet trembled, and I felt a surge of fear rise in my chest. But then, just as quickly as it started, the rumbling stopped. The light faded, and the forest was silent once more. "What the hell just happened?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, my heart still racing. "But I think we just activated something. Let's keep moving." We continued through the forest, following the map to the next marked spot. The further we went, the more the forest seemed to come alive. The whispers grew louder, and strange, shadowy figures started appearing in the corners of my vision, only to vanish when I turned to look at them. Finally, we reached the second location, a large, gnarled tree with twisted branches that looked like they were reaching out to grab us. There was another altar here, similar to the first one, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. "Do we do the same thing?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my hands trembling as I opened the book again. I found another page with the same kind of symbols and started reading them aloud. The forest seemed to close in around us as I spoke, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. As before, the altar began to glow, and the ground trembled beneath our feet. But this time, the rumbling didn't stop. The light grew brighter, and the air was filled with a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was tall and thin, with long, bony limbs and a face that was nothing more than a black void. It moved slowly, deliberately, its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, locked onto us. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from the altar. We sprinted through the forest, the creature close behind us. The trees seemed to twist and shift as we ran, the path changing with every step. I could hear the creature's heavy breathing, feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Finally, we burst out into another clearing, the creature nowhere in sight. We collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. "What the hell was that?" Mia asked, her voice shaking with fear. "I don't know," I replied, still trying to catch my breath. "But I think it was guarding the next spot on the map. We need to be more careful." Jake looked at me, his face pale. "How much further do we have to go?" I checked the map again, my hands trembling. "Just one more spot," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then, hopefully, we'll find a way out of here." We didn't waste any time catching our breath. The thought of that creature lurking somewhere in the woods pushed us forward. We were too scared to stay still for long. I held onto the book like it was the only thing keeping us alive, which, honestly, it might have been. The last spot on the map was further than the others. We walked for what felt like hours, but it was hard to tell time in this place. The sky, or whatever was above the treetops, had stayed the same dark gray since we'd started, and the fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The sounds in the forest were getting louder, too. The whispers had turned into low murmurs, and every now and then, we'd hear twigs snapping or leaves rustling nearby, even though we couldn't see anything. I tried to tell myself it was just the game's way of messing with us, but that didn't make it any easier to handle. "Are we almost there?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I checked the map again. We were close, but not close enough. "Just a little further," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "We're almost there." Jake was walking beside me, quiet for the first time since we'd started playing. I could tell he was scared, but he was trying to hold it together. I didn't blame him. I was terrified too. But we couldn't stop now. We had to keep going. When we finally reached the last spot on the map, it wasn't what I expected. There was no altar this time, no strange markings or glowing symbols. Just a small, circular clearing with a stone well in the center. The well was old and covered in moss, with a rope hanging down into the darkness below. "This is it?" Jake asked, looking around. "What are we supposed to do now?" I looked at the book, flipping through the pages. There wasn't anything about a well, but I had a feeling this was the final test. "I think we have to go down there," I said, pointing to the well. Mia stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "You're kidding, right? We don't even know how deep it is." "I don't think we have a choice," I replied. "This has to be the way out. There's nothing else here." Jake looked at the well, then back at us. "I'll go first," he said, surprising me. "I'm the heaviest. If the rope can hold me, it'll hold all of us." I wanted to argue, to tell him there had to be another way, but I knew he was right. We didn't have time to debate. That creature, or whatever else was out there, could be closing in on us even now. Jake grabbed the rope and gave it a hard tug. It seemed sturdy enough, so he wrapped it around his hands and started lowering himself into the well. Mia and I watched, holding our breath as he slowly disappeared into the darkness. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then, we heard his voice echoing up from the well. "It's not that far. Come on down." Mia looked at me, and I could see the fear in her eyes. But she nodded, and without another word, she grabbed the rope and started down after Jake. I waited until she was almost at the bottom before following. Climbing down the well was harder than I expected. The stone walls were wet and slippery, and the further down I went, the darker it got. By the time my feet touched the ground, I couldn't see anything at all. The only sound was our breathing and the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness. "Are you guys okay?" I whispered, not sure why I was still trying to be quiet. "Yeah," Jake replied, "but I can't see anything. Did you bring the book?" "I've got it," I said, reaching into my pocket. I pulled out the book and flipped it open, hoping for some kind of clue, but the pages were blank. Whatever magic or curse had filled it before was gone now. "The pages are empty," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't know what we're supposed to do." Mia's voice came from somewhere close by. "Look, there's something glowing over there." I squinted into the darkness, and sure enough, there was a faint light coming from further down the tunnel. Without any other options, we moved toward it, careful not to slip on the damp stones beneath our feet. The light led us to a small chamber, barely big enough for the three of us to stand in. In the center was another stone altar, but this one was different. It was covered in strange, glowing symbols, the same ones that had been in the book earlier. And floating above the altar was a small, black orb, pulsing with an eerie, dark light. "What is that?" Jake asked, his voice filled with awe and fear. "I don't know," I replied, taking a step closer. "But I think this is what we've been looking for." Mia looked at the orb, then back at me. "What do we do with it?" I hesitated, my mind racing. We'd come so far, but I had no idea what to do next. All I knew was that we had to get out of this nightmare. "Maybe we're supposed to destroy it," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was the right answer. Before anyone could say anything, the chamber started to shake. The walls groaned, and the ground trembled beneath our feet. The light from the orb grew brighter, and I felt a strange pull, like it was trying to draw us in. "We need to do something, now," Jake shouted, panic rising in his voice. I grabbed a rock from the floor and, without thinking, hurled it at the orb. The moment the rock made contact, there was a blinding flash of light. I felt a force knock me backward, and then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, everything was still dark, but it wasn't the same kind of darkness as before. This was different. It was like the shadows were alive, pressing in on me from all sides. My head was spinning, and my whole body ached like I'd been hit by a truck. "Mia? Jake?" I called out, my voice shaky. I tried to stand, but the ground felt uneven, like I was balancing on a narrow ledge. "Here," Mia's voice came from somewhere to my left. She sounded scared, more scared than I'd ever heard her. "I'm right here." "Me too," Jake added, his voice trembling. "What the hell just happened? Where are we?" I couldn't answer him because I didn't know. The last thing I remembered was throwing the rock at that orb, and now we were, wherever this was. The chamber, the altar, the well, they were all gone. We were standing in some kind of endless void, with no walls, no ceiling, and no way to tell which way was up. "I don't like this," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. "This isn't right. We need to get out of here." She wasn't wrong, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness stretched on forever in every direction. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. "We need to stay together," I said, more to myself than to them. "We can figure this out. We just have to." Before I could finish, the darkness shifted. Shapes started to form in the shadows, twisted, nightmarish figures that moved closer and closer. I could feel their eyes on us, even though I couldn't see their faces. The air grew colder, and a low, guttural sound filled the void, like 1,000 voices whispering at once. "Run!" Mia shouted, grabbing my arm. I didn't need to be told twice. We took off, sprinting through the dark, even though there was no path to follow, no light to guide us. The only thing that mattered was getting away from those things, whatever they were. But no matter how fast we ran, the shadows were always right behind us. I could feel them closing in, their cold breath on the back of my neck. My heart was pounding in my chest, my lungs burning with every breath. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. Then, just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw a faint light in the distance. It was small, barely more than a pinprick, but it was there. "Look!" I shouted, pointing ahead. "There's something up ahead." Mia and Jake saw it too, and we pushed ourselves to run faster. The light grew brighter as we got closer, and I realized it was some kind of door, a way out of this nightmare. But the shadows weren't giving up. They were right on our heels, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. I could feel the darkness pulling at me, trying to drag me back. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. We reached the door just as the shadows closed in around us. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open, practically throwing myself through it. Mia and Jake followed, and the moment we were all inside, I slammed the door shut behind us. The whisper stopped, and the darkness was gone. We were back in the forest, but something was different. The trees looked taller, the air heavier, like the whole world had shifted somehow. "Did we make it?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, looking around. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and I had the sinking feeling that our escape had only led us into deeper trouble. But I think we're still in the game. Jake cursed under his breath. "How is that possible? We should have been out by now." "I don't know," I admitted, "but we have to keep moving. That thing might still be out here." We started walking again, not sure where we were going, just hoping to find something that would tell us how to get out. The forest was different now, darker and more twisted, like the trees themselves were watching us. Every sound made me jump, every shadow made my heart race. We kept going, even though we didn't know what else to do. The path seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning through the trees. The fog was thicker now, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I tried to push it down. We had to stay calm, had to keep it together. Then, just when I thought we were lost for good, we saw something up ahead. A light, flickering through the trees. It was faint, but it was there, a beacon in the darkness. We hurried toward it, hoping it was a way out, but as we got closer, I realized it wasn't what I'd expected. It wasn't an exit. It was a campfire. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the air. Around it, there were several old, worn-out tents, the kind you'd find in a summer camp from decades ago. The whole place had an eerie, abandoned feel to it, like whoever had been here left in a hurry and never came back. "This place is giving me the creeps," Jake muttered, looking around nervously. "We should keep moving." "Wait," Mia said, stepping closer to the fire. "Look." There was something lying next to the fire, something small and square. I knelt down to get a better look and felt my blood run cold when I saw what it was. It was a videotape. The label was faded, but I could still make out the words written on it in messy, black ink, "The Blair Witch Project." My hands trembled as I picked up the tape. This can't be real," I whispered, but deep down I knew it was. The game, the forest, the well, it had all been leading us here to this moment. "What do we do with it?" Mia asked, her voice barely audible. I stared at the tape, my mind racing. The game wasn't just a game. It was something more, something darker, and this tape was the key. But I didn't know if watching it would save us or doom us for good. Before I could decide, the fire suddenly flared up, the flames growing taller and hotter. The ground beneath our feet started to tremble, and the whispers returned, louder and more frantic than before. The shadows in the trees shifted, moving closer, and I realized with a sickening dread that the endgame had begun. "We have to watch it," I said, my voice shaking. "It's the only way." Mia and Jake looked at me, fear in their eyes, but they nodded. We were in this together, whatever it was. I took a deep breath and reached out to put the tape in the small, old-fashioned VCR that I hadn't noticed until now, sitting next to the fire. The moment I pressed play, everything changed. As the tape began to play, the crackling of the fire grew louder, merging with the grainy static on the screen. The image flickered to life, showing shaky footage of a dense, foggy forest. It looked eerily similar to where we were now, the trees tall and menacing, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. This looks like where we are," Jake whispered, his eyes glued to the screen. The camera on the tape panned slowly, revealing more of the forest. The person holding it was breathing heavily, clearly frightened. Every so often, the camera would jerk as if the person had heard something in the distance. The only sound other than the breathing was the crunch of leaves underfoot, but it was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, like something was waiting just out of sight. Then, the camera stopped, focusing on a pile of stones arranged in a small circle on the ground. They looked ancient, covered in moss and dirt. The person holding the camera moved closer, and that's when we saw it, a small, crude doll made of twigs and string lying in the center of the circle. "Oh God," Mia breathed. "That's just like the dolls we saw before." The screen flickered, and suddenly, the image changed. The camera was now pointing at something else, a small, run-down cabin in the middle of the woods. The walls were warped, the wood rotting and falling apart, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. The door was slightly ajar, and the camera slowly zoomed in on the darkness inside. "No way," Jake muttered, shaking his head. "We're not going in there. I don't care what happens next." But as much as I wanted to agree with him, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. I had the horrible feeling that we didn't have a choice. This tape, this story, it was pulling us in, guiding us to something we couldn't escape. The camera entered the cabin, the door creaking as it pushed open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the floor littered with broken furniture and shattered glass. The only light came from the camera itself, casting long shadows across the room. There was something on the walls, but it was hard to make out what it was. The camera moved closer, and I felt my stomach drop when I realized what I was seeing. Handprints. Dozens of them, smeared across the walls in dark, dried blood. The camera lingered on them for a moment before turning toward a set of stairs leading down into the basement. The breathing grew heavier, more frantic, but the person behind the camera didn't stop. They began to descend, each step echoing in the silence. "I don't want to see this," Mia whispered, clutching my arm. "I really don't want to see this." I didn't blame her. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn away, to stop the tape, but I couldn't. The screen held me captive, as if whatever was on the other side had reached out and taken hold of me. The basement was pitch black, the camera's light barely cutting through the darkness. There was something down there, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The camera moved slowly, carefully, sweeping across the room until it stopped on a figure standing in the corner, facing the wall. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, its clothes tattered and dirty, its head bowed as if in shame or fear. The camera inched closer, and I could feel the tension building, like something terrible was about to happen. Then, without warning, the figure turned around. The screen went black. The fire flared up one last time before snuffing out completely, plunging us into darkness. My heart was racing, and I could hear Mia and Jake breathing heavily beside me, both of them as terrified as I was. What just happened?" Jake stammered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I whispered back, my hands shaking. The darkness around us felt thicker than before, more oppressive, as if it were closing in on us. I could still feel the grip of the story, the pull of whatever was controlling this nightmare. Mia spoke up, her voice barely audible. Do you think we're supposed to find that cabin? Like in the tape?" Her words sent a chill down my spine. The idea of finding that place, of stepping inside it after what we'd just seen, made me want to run as far away as possible. But there was a part of me that knew she was right. The game had been leading us somewhere from the start, and now we knew where. "We don't have a choice," I said, trying to steady my voice. "If we want to get out of here, we have to find that cabin." Jake looked at me like I'd just told him we were going to walk into our own graves. "Are you serious? After everything we just saw?" I nodded, though every part of me was screaming not to. "I don't think we have another option. The game isn't going to let us go until we finish it." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of what we were about to do. Finally, Mia took a deep breath and stood up. "Let's go, then," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "Let's find that cabin." With no other choice, we set off into the woods again, the memory of the tape haunting our every step. The forest seemed to grow darker and more twisted the further we went, the trees closing in around us. The path was almost impossible to follow, but somehow we knew which way to go, as if the game itself was guiding us. The sounds of the forest grew louder, more menacing, the whispers returning to surround us on all sides. I could feel the presence of something watching us, stalking us through the trees, but whenever I looked, there was nothing there. After what felt like an eternity, we finally saw it, the cabin from the tape, hidden deep within the forest. It was exactly as it had appeared on the screen, old and decaying, with that same sense of dread hanging in the air. We stood there for a moment, just staring at it, none of us wanting to take the first step. But we knew we had to. The endgame was here, and there was no turning back. "I'll go first," I said, surprising even myself. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but somehow I forced myself to move. The others followed, their footsteps hesitant and fearful. The door was still slightly ajar, just like in the tape. I pushed it open, and the same creaking sound echoed through the forest, sending a shiver down my spine. Inside, the cabin was just as we'd seen it, covered in dust and debris, the handprints on the walls still visible even in the dim light. "This place is even worse in person," Jake muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. We moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything, as if the whole place might collapse if we did. Every step felt like it brought us closer to something terrible, something we couldn't escape. When we reached the stairs leading down to the basement, I hesitated. The memory of the figure in the tape was fresh in my mind, and the thought of going down there filled me with a sense of dread so strong I could barely breathe. "We have to finish this," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, though every part of me wanted to turn and run. But I knew there was no running from this. We had to face whatever was down there, or we'd never get out of this nightmare. Taking a deep breath, I started down the stairs, Mia and Jake right behind me. The air grew colder with every step, the darkness thicker, until it felt like we were walking into a void. The basement was exactly as it had been in the tape, pitch black except for the faint light from the camera, which now felt like it was coming from within the room itself. And then we saw it. The figure was standing in the corner, just like before, its back to us had bowed. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. I knew what was going to happen, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. "Mia, Jake," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Get ready to run." As soon as I spoke, the figure began to turn around, just like in the tape. The light flickered, and I saw its face, a twisted, horrible reflection of my own. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, the others right behind me, but the darkness was closing in, pulling us back. The whispers were louder now, frantic, as if the whole forest was screaming at us. But we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. The only thing that mattered was getting out, getting away from whatever was down there. We burst out of the cabin, the door slamming shut behind us with a force that shook the ground. The forest was alive with movement, the shadows swirling around us, but the cabin was gone, swallowed by the darkness. "We have to keep moving," I shouted, not sure if the others could even hear me over the noise. We ran through the forest, the path twisting and turning, but I didn't care where it led, as long as it was away from that cabin. Finally, we broke through the trees and into a clearing, the forest falling silent around us. We stopped, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. The air was colder in the clearing, and the silence was almost oppressive. We looked around, trying to catch our breath, but our relief was short-lived. The forest had seemed to close in on us, and now it felt as though we were in a new, even more terrifying place. "We made it out," Mia said, her voice shaky but filled with a hint of hope. "But where are we?" I looked around, trying to make sense of our surroundings. The clearing was barren, with only a few sparse trees and patches of dead grass. In the center stood an old, weathered sign that had clearly been here for years, its message barely readable. Jake moved closer to it, squinting at the faded letters. It says, "Welcome to Hollow Creek." The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. A sense of dread crept up again. This place seemed like it was part of a larger, more insidious game, one that had been toying with us from the beginning. "This can't be good," Jake muttered. "We need to get out of here before whatever is after us finds us again." I nodded, feeling the same urgency. We had escaped the cabin, but the forest still held many secrets. We needed to find a way out, and soon. As we began to move through the clearing, I noticed something peculiar, a small path leading away from the open space. It was barely visible, overgrown with weeds, and almost hidden in the darkness. "This way," I said, pointing to the path. "Maybe it leads us out of here." We followed the path, our footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. The forest seemed to be alive, whispering around us as if warning us to turn back. Despite the fear gripping us, we pressed on, driven by the need to escape the nightmare we'd found ourselves in. The path wound through the trees, and soon we reached a dilapidated bridge spanning a shallow, murky creek. The bridge looked barely stable, but it was the only way across. With no other options, we made our way across carefully, one by one. As we reached the other side, we noticed a small house in the distance, barely visible through the dense foliage. The sight filled me with a mix of relief and apprehension. It looked like it might be inhabited, and we desperately needed help. "We should check it out," Mia suggested. "It might be our best chance." We approached the house cautiously, the darkness still hanging heavy around us. The closer we got, the more I could see that the house was indeed old and run down, but there was a light flickering in the window. It looked like someone, or something, was inside. We knocked on the door, our hearts racing as we waited for a response. After a tense moment, the door creaked open and an elderly woman appeared, her face lined with age and worry. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We need help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We've been in the forest and—" Before I could finish, the woman's eyes widened in recognition. "You shouldn't be here," she said urgently. "You need to leave. Now." Panic surged through me as I realized something was very wrong. "What do you mean?" "We don't know where to go." The woman looked past us, her face growing pale. "The forest. It takes people. You must leave before it's too late." As her words sank in, the lights in the house flickered and went out. The door slammed shut, leaving us in the dark once more. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than before. It was clear that we were still far from safe. We had to keep moving, but with the forest closing in around us, it felt like there was no escape from the horror that pursued us. With no other choice, we ventured back into the darkness of the forest, our fear driving us forward as we tried to find a way out of this endless nightmare. The darkness of the forest seemed almost alive, wrapping around us like a suffocating shroud. The whispers grew louder, the sounds of the forest melding into a cacophony of eerie voices. With no clear direction, we trudged through the underbrush, the sense of urgency driving us forward. As we moved, the path became increasingly difficult to navigate. The trees seemed to shift, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers trying to pull us back. Every sound made us jump, every shadow made us pause. The forest was relentless, its labyrinthine twists and turns defying any sense of orientation. "We need to find something," Jake said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Anything that can guide us out of here." We stumbled upon a small, ancient-looking stone structure partially hidden by vines and moss. It resembled a shrine or altar of some sort, but the details were obscured by the encroaching darkness. "This might be a clue," Mia suggested, her breath fogging in the cold night air. "Maybe it's something from the game." We approached the structure cautiously. Carved into the stone were symbols and runes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. As I traced the patterns with my fingers, a low, ominous hum filled the air. The ground beneath us began to tremble slightly, making it clear that the forest was reacting to our presence. Suddenly, the whispers grew deafening, almost as if the forest was speaking directly to us, demanding something. The runes on the stone structure began to pulse with a strange light, and we saw something shift in the darkness, a shadowy figure, barely visible, but unmistakably watching us. "We're not alone," I whispered urgently. "We need to get out of here." As we turned to leave, the ground shifted beneath us, and we were forced to scramble as the earth seemed to open up, creating a wide chasm between us and the path we had just taken. The figure in the shadows stepped closer, its form becoming more defined, but still indistinct. Panic surged as we looked for another way out. The chasm seemed to stretch endlessly, and the figure, now clearer, appeared to be a silhouette of someone we might have known, someone we couldn't quite place, but who looked hauntingly familiar. In the distance, the light of dawn began to filter through the trees, casting eerie shadows and highlighting the strange symbols on the stone. The light was both a beacon of hope and a reminder of the unknown dangers that still lurked in the darkness. "We have to make a choice," Mia said, her voice trembling. "Either we try to find a way across this chasm, or we face whatever that figure is." The forest was closing in on us, the whispers growing more frantic as if urging us to act. The figure seemed to be waiting, patient but menacing, as if it were a part of the forest itself. Jake looked at me, his eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. "What do we do?" I looked at the chasm, then at the figure, and finally at the distant light of dawn. The options were clear yet daunting: attempt to traverse the chasm and hope for the best, confront the mysterious figure and uncover its purpose, or wait and see if the light of dawn would bring any answers. As the forest's whispers reached a fever pitch, I knew that whatever choice we made would lead us into the unknown. There were no guarantees, no clear paths forward, only the uncertainty of what lay ahead. With a deep breath, I turned to my friends. "We need to decide now. No matter what happens, we face it together." The choices lay before us, each with its own dangers and possibilities. As we prepared to take the next step, the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what we would do. And so, with the fate of our journey hanging in the balance, we took our first step into the uncertain future, knowing that whatever lay ahead, it would be a test of our courage and resolve.